Hey everybody, and welcome to another video from the Electronic Armory. In this 3D game development video, we'll be continuing our series in creating this character and animating its armature so that we can have a walk cycle, an idle cycle, and any other animation that you want to put into your game. We'll then UV unwrap this character so we can apply an image to it so we can give him some skin, some clothes, and then we'll put that into Unreal Engine. So let's get started. So as you can see here, we have our character that we created in the last video. We have the ability to pose and move its arm because we have a armature set up here. And let's get started doing the basic animation cycle for his walk. Before I do that, I'm going to save and I'm going to go over to the animation tab at the top. All right, so Blender gives us two views. One is a kind of a rendered view of where our camera currently is. If we want to change that, all we need to do is kind of zoom in our character, kind of have a good angle of maybe if it's a game from the top down, maybe we want to see what the animation looks like in that perspective. If it's a side scroller, maybe we want to have it in the side view or the other side view. Hit Control 3 for that and kind of see from left to right or the other side away. I'm just going to keep it kind of a top down and see how our walk cycle looks from this angle. I'm going to hit Control Alt 0 and put our camera at that spot, and you can see that mirrors what we have over here. It's kind of hiding his foot a little bit. Let's move this camera just a little bit, maybe move him up a little bit, and then Control Alt 0 again. And if you still don't like that, you can hit the N key, you can go to View, we can lock the camera to View, and as we move in our viewport, it also moves the camera. So I can zoom in, I can zoom out, and get kind of a good angle this way. And you can see that this is changing our rendered view here. All right, so I'm going to turn that off so that I can go back into our viewport. I'm going to take that camera, go in object mode, select the camera, hit H so we can hide it. All right, from here, what I'm going to do is going to side view mode so that we can control his legs. But I really need to grab that armature first. Go over to our object data properties for the armature. Go over to viewport display and then select in front because we'll be selecting these bones quite a bit. Oops, these bones, and then go to pose mode first so that we can move our mesh. And you can see on the left hand side how that moves. We can constrain it to the X so that you can see our leg move. So just like we did in a couple videos ago, what we're going to want to do is set up a action for the different animations that we have. So I'm going to right click on here, I'm going to split this horizontally, and this looks good here. Go over to our dope sheet, and once our dope sheet is selected here, we can go down to our action editor. We can make this a little bit bigger so we can see more of the controls, and we're going to create a new action and rename that action walking. Okay, and before we begin any animation, again, we want to set up our scene appropriately so that everything else is a lot easier from here on out. And so the first thing I'm going to want to do is select all of these bones, go over to our pose library, also in our properties, our object data properties here. Under pose mode, I'm going to create a new pose library, which will drop this down, and it's called pose lib. I'm going to create a new pose in this library. And this one is just going to be standing or idle. So you can name it whatever you want. I'm going to add a new pose, and I'm just going to say you can call it default, you can call it idle, whatever you want to call it. Whatever makes sense to you so that you easily know that this pose matches this particular orientation of all these bones. So that if I change it, maybe raise the arm up, I don't have to go back and say, okay, what is that? Try to reset that back to its original position. Instead, I can go over to the pose library, select the pose that I want, and then hit this little magnifying glass, and it will reset it back to that particular pose. So that'll save us a lot of time there. Now, I did move this arm before, and it is not perfectly up and down. So I'm going to go to the item, and you can see that the rotation is set up a little bit strangely. It doesn't have a perfect 0, 0, 0 down the XYZ axis, and we also have this W orientation, or what's known as Quaternions. So instead of Quaternion, we can go to XYZ Euler, or Euler. And now you can see that our orientations on these are a little bit off of 0. So we were rotating it on the X. You can see it's about a half a degree off from 0, which is not much, but we'll just reset everything back to 0. And if you hit 0 while in the viewport, it'll go to the camera. So that's what happened there. All right, so because I've reset the pose, I want to make this our new pose. I'm going to select the idle pose. I'm going to hit the plus button again. I can add a new one and then maybe delete the old one. I can add a new one at the current frame, or I can replace an existing pose, which is what I want to do, and replace what's currently selected with the idle pose. And actually, I'm going to make sure all my bones are selected and do that one more time. Just to make sure we got everything. Okay, so again, we can select these bones, move them all or sorts of places like this. Get pretty crazy, and then go back to our idle. But you gotta select all the bones, because if you just have one bone selected, only that one bone will go back to the idle. So make sure you have all those selected before selecting the idle. So if that's not working for you, again, make sure all the bones are selected. All right, so for our walk animation, what we're going to do is we're going to loop this, and we'll make it a slow walk, just kind of get this going here. And we'll put it about 120. It's going to be a lot shorter than this, but that's okay. It's about 30 frames a second, so this one walk cycle will be 4 seconds, but I'll show you how to shrink it down to make it faster or slower. So let's go and set this whole timeline to between 0 and 120. Otherwise, our playhead will continue to 250. So let's go to the end down here in the bottom right hand corner and just select 120, and that way we can zoom in with our mouse wheel, middle click to drag this over, and we can kind of get a little bit more space on our timeline. I'm going to drag the playhead to frame 1, and this will be the start of our animation. So as he's walking, he's swinging his arms, he's swinging his legs, and what we can do is we can keep that orientation that we currently have in the middle of his cycle. And I'll show you what that means in a second. So with all of these bones selected, I'm going to hit the I key, and we're going to add a keyframe. And again, we covered some of this in our previous video on animation. And I'm going to add just a rotation keyframe for this. If you want to have a little bit more advanced animations and keyframes, you could add the location if you're going to transform the bone, but we're just going to be doing rotation in this case. So I'm just going to select rotation. And that'll add a keyframe for all of those bones. And as we change the bones, that it will always go from frame 1 to frame 0, or excuse me, frame 120, and reset it back to this by again adding another keyframe. All right, so added a keyframe at the beginning and a keyframe at the end. And so as we animate this and play through here, that it will always start in this idle pose and end at the idle pose. But in the middle, say line or frame 60, what we want to have is be in another orientation for our walk cycle. So we're going to have this arm move up, and after we move it up, make sure we set the rotation keyframe. I'm going to set this other arm along the x-axis in the back direction. Make sure you add a keyframe. And do the same thing with the legs. However, the legs are going to be opposing with the arms. Add a keyframe. Rotate this along the X, add a keyframe, and just make sure he's not going too crazy with the back leg. Every time I move it, I could either add a keyframe, or we have the ability to auto keyframe. But again, I like to be a little bit explicit with my keyframes so we don't add too many keyframes. All right, so now as I scrub through this playhead, you can see it goes from idle to the walking and then back again. However, he's not swinging his right leg back. So what we're going to do is I'm going to deselect all these keyframes because they're all currently selected. That's why they're orange. Hit Alt-A, that'll deselect those, and then hit B to box select, or you can shift click on those. And instead of this being in the middle of the pose, this is not currently the middle of his walk pose. This is only a quarter of his walk cycle. So I'm going to move it instead of 60, I'm going to hit the G key, and I'm going to move that to 30. And now you can see as I scrub through this, he's putting his right foot forward. And it looks like we have a orphaned keyframe here, and that's because when I move these keyframes, I was just doing the one leg. So make sure we have all of our bones selected, unselect the keyframes there and then box select those and drag those over to frame 30. And that will affect all of the keyframes that are currently selected. So as we choose the different bones, you can see that our timeline down here shows just the right leg in this case, the left leg, the spine, etc. So if we have all of these, we can control the keyframes that way. All right, so as I mentioned, this is a quarter of the way through. And so another quarter would be at 60. And this is where we would want to put him back into the idle pose. And so what I can do is make sure all the bones are selected, go to our idle pose in our library, hit that little question mark or that little magnifying glass, whatever that is, and now it puts it back into our idle pose. But again, we want to make sure that we add a keyframe to all those bones so that you can see he's walking and then he's returning to idle, but then he's going to swing back the other way in another 30 frames or in S, and you can see that it's scaling it toward the playhead. So as I kind of scroll this through, so if I want to just make it faster, what I can do is put the playhead at the beginning, hit A to select all of our keyframes, S, and that will shrink it down. So if we do 100, you can see a quarter, 25, 50, 75. Play that, test it out, see if that's too slow, which it appears to be. And again, just play around with it. Shift left arrow, we'll put our playhead to the beginning so we can continue to scale this down. In Unreal Engine, we can speed this up a little bit, so we don't have to get this perfect, but it is a good idea to at least get the baseline of a simple walk cycle. You can see that it's pausing for about half of the animation, so I'm going to click and drag this down to about 60 so that it loops. There's a little bit of a stutter in our step. We'll take care of that in a second. But we can see that this is getting a little bit better. I think if we put this back down, S, to about 50 frames total, at 30 frames a second, that's, you know, a little less than 2 seconds. About 1 2/3 seconds. I don't know, what do you guys think? Maybe a little bit faster. Yeah, I think that looks good. All right, so that was at 40 frames, and I think that's okay. All right, let's fix this little stutter so he kind of comes to the end of our animation. He looks like he stops and then begins again. There's a couple ways to fix that. We can remove one frame, so instead of starting on 40, we start on 39, which, because frame 40 is a duplicate of frame 1, that's why it appears to kind of stop on that frame a little bit. But he's still a little bit of a stutter right as he goes from the two animations. So the way that we fix that is the tween, or the in-between of this keyframe and this keyframe, or these sets of keyframes, it's not actually a linear animation. What it does is, as it gets closer to frame 40, it does an ease, which kind of slows the animation down as it gets to that endpoint. So as it comes closer to 40, it slows down that walk, and then as it begins the animation, it speeds it up slowly. So that's why kind of when he stops at this animation, instead of carrying through like he does this one, he kind of comes to a pause. And we can fix that using the graph editor. So select this view if you want to with the graph editor. Make sure we're still on the walk cycle action. And we can see that on the x-axis, which is what we're animating, it goes up, comes back down. But as it comes into the last frame, you can kind of see it slows down and curves. And that's going to be our animation curve. So we want to affect that. We want to change how that works and make it a little bit more linear. Because if you look at this curve, it's basically linear until it gets to this point, which is our, if we use our playhead here, which is at the kind of the apex of his foot coming out, and then it slowly comes back. So we actually want to keep that curve, because as he kicks out, he's slowing down and then he's bringing his foot back. But that's how you would fix that if you wanted to change how his leg's coming out. So for this one, what we want to do is affect the legs and the arms. So I can select the two legs, make sure everything's deselected first. All right, so I'm just selecting the arms and the legs, and that way it'll allow me to select this a little bit easier with all the other keyframes that we had in there. I'm going to hit the V key, and the V key will give us different handle types. And I'm going to choose vector because this one is going to allow us the easiest way to make this linear. So this is on the x-axis for all of these rotations, which were only affecting the x-axis. And then on this one, we can do the same thing, vector. But again, we're going to keep this one as a curve because he's bringing his leg up, slowing down, and then speeding up again. So let's take a look at what this looks like. All right, not perfect, but pretty good. So I'm keeping my eye on the left-hand side here. I don't usually look at this because it's a little distracting with all the bones, but this is what's going to look like in our game. All right, once we have that animation done, I'm gonna make sure I save that. I haven't saved it in a while. And we're going to turn our graph editor back into our action editor by going to the dope sheet and then making sure that this drop down shows the action editor. Okay, so this is our walk cycle. We're going to create a new action by hitting this little, looks like a copy icon, but it is indeed create new action. And we're going to, I guess it is a copy because it does copy it, but it is a new action. This one's just going to be called idle. And what we're going to do is just select all of these keyframes by hitting A, hit X, delete keyframes, and actually make sure all your bones are selected again. I do that quite often. All the keyframes, delete all the keyframes. Okay, so when I deleted all of the keyframes, what it did is actually got rid of our action from this menu. But if we drop this down, you can see that we still have our idle in there. And I did accidentally create another idle by mistake, but that's okay. So in our pose library, just make sure that we're currently in that idle state, and we're gonna make sure that we have a keyframe on the rotation on all of our bones. Select all your bones first, hit the I key again, select rotation, and that'll put a keyframe. And our idle animation might be a little bit longer than our walk cycle. We might have him checking his watch, tapping his foot, and those might be separate animations, but let's just say we kind of want to have a longer animation that he sways back and forth. Let's say about 100 frames, which is a little bit more than 3 seconds long, which is kind of short, but you can play around with it and get a feel for it. So I'm going to set this to 100 just to make sure our animation loop or our playhead loop will loop between 0 and 100 frames, or 1 and 100 frames, I should say. All right, so then at the end of our cycle, we're again wanting to duplicate all of these keyframes. So I could select all of these bones again, hit I, etc., or I could select these keyframes down here, Shift D, just like we do in the viewport, and just drag those over. And you can see the orange lines represent the fact that these keyframes do not change between these frames, but I want them to. So let's go to about the middle, and we're just gonna have him, swing his arm a little bit this way, hit I, set a keyframe on the rotate, maybe do there, and just play around with it. He's gonna spin his head on the x-axis. And so you can get the idea of he's kind of moving a little bit back and forth. He's turning his head, looking around. Maybe he's even swaying. So I'm going to select all the bones, Alt-A to deselect, box select these. I'm going to move these to about a third. Go over here and just kind of do it again, but maybe in a slightly different orientation. So maybe going to move the leg out, rotate that. Maybe have him look up a little bit. And maybe slightly to his right. Set a keyframe for that. And just play around with it. So again, keep your eye on the top left-hand corner. It's a pretty decent idle animation, nothing to write home about, but you get the idea. We can play around with it, add in a foot tap or whatever you want to do here. But you could have different actions in here like idle, foot tap, idle, check, watch, and then in Unreal Engine we can loop between those different animations so that we can basically have a whole bunch of variety so that we keep our player entertained. All right, so I hope you found that useful. We can basically add in a whole bunch of different animations, and then we'll take those animations, pull them into Unreal, and then use Unreal to control what our player is currently doing by setting the animation, whether the animation is a run, which is just a fast, in our case, a fast walk, or he's standing still, not moving, in which case we'll switch over to the idle animation so that he's just kind of swaying there and moving. And then if you have any other animations that you want to do, like an axe swing, then you can imagine that would be pretty quick to set a keyframe up here and then another keyframe on our bottom of the axe swing. So maybe I'll leave that as an exercise to you. If you want to see me do it, leave a comment below and I'll handle any kind of animation that you want to see us do, and we'll do it together. And then in the next video, we're going to unwrap this guy so we can apply some skins to him. And then I'll show you how to dynamically do that so that we can swap between the different skins in Unreal Engine. So we can use the same exact model to be an enemy or the player character himself or some other non-player character that walks around our environment. Again, using the same idle animations if he's just standing there, or the walk animation if the non-player character is moving around our scene. And we accomplish that simply by choosing a different material with a different texture. So catch that in the next video. Again, I hope you found this video useful. If you like what you see, hit the like button. If you want to see other videos in this series on 3D game development, hit the subscribe button. We also have videos on iOS development, Android development, web development, and more. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.